needs to be given a name on Christine, which is accurate. But
well, hello again, everybody. Welcome to Aquarius Rising, Australia. We are doing it on Friday this week instead of Monday. Very, very tough to have again back with us Gabby, as always. Welcome, honey hun. And then KERRI Saint again, and special guest Kristen Coralive. Have I said it correctly? Coralive? Yeah.
yes.
Who was adopted and sold. Just horrible stories, yeah. But nonetheless, ones that we definitely need to hear. So, welcome, ladies. I'm so happy to have you all at our round table again this morning, sharing truths, waking the sleepers up, the sleepwalkers. Shame, I don't mean to be mean. I don't. I'm sorry. I don't. It's just the way that it is right now. Anyway, so I'm just so grateful to have you here again sharing. So over to you, gals. How is everyone in Oz? As you can see, it's getting cold here.
I know, winter. Thank you
Yeah,
for asking.
absolutely.
I'm looking forward to it over the heat. So I'm looking forward to nice chilly mornings around the fireplace, and yes, I'm looking forward to it. So bring it on. Yeah.
There's something very nice about, I have to say, making my chai tea in the morning, making my oatmeal, having a chilly morning, and making my soups. I love soups in winter, so I make lots of yummy soups. And I must say, there's that I enjoy about winter, but man alive, I'm not into cold weather.
It's the adjustment period, isn't it? It's kind of like when it hits,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, is it really like this again?
And I keep complaining we've hardly even had summer here. I mean, we had our first warm days here in January. So we've hardly even had summer, and boom, winter's back again. Anyway, it is what it is. We're happy, and I know that you guys have had floods galore and all sorts of things going on there in Oz, and I really just hope everyone and everything is safe. But really good to have you ladies, so thank you. Enough about the cold weather, let's talk about our warm hearts.
Warm hearts, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to say to you, Chantelle, like, thank you very much for giving us your platform to speak on, because I've been an adoptee activist for 35 years, I guess, and we're silenced, like, we're deliberately silenced, well, in Australia. I think if you look at all the adoptee stories, they'd be like what we call happy-dappy, adoptee stories that, justify the crimes and the evil that they committed in their child trafficking. So, yeah, thank you for that. And I was really excited the other day to hear that you're going to interview Michael Tellinger.
Yes, Michael
Yeah,
Tellinger, you know him? I know he's awesome. Very
he is.
awesome.
I've been following Michael for years. I think, because he's uncovering the hidden history, and I mean, that's what we had to live with, was, a state-imposed hidden history. And, I actually met him in Melbourne, and an interesting aside, one of his passions are the elongated skulls.
Yeah.
And ones that he found in Paracas, he had like DNA tested fairly recently. And interestingly, their maternal hagiogroups, some of them were European, including my own, which is H1A. So these that are considered a different species, given that they haven't got the markings on their skulls. So he's uncovering, the hidden truth of our history. So that was my, it was a pleasure to meet him. So I'm looking forward to that.
He's an amazing guy.
And his one town concept, I mean, I'm 68, so, I mean, I was a young mother in the 70s, and I'm really grateful for that period of time. I mean, we had a window of opportunity at that point, I feel like, as a culture. it slammed shut quite quickly. Now it's like nailed up and boarded over. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was there, and I was a mother, and I mean, we didn't expect the government to hand things out to us. We just got on and did things, and this, I mean, I was probably the last wave of mothers that reared their own children and didn't go, you know, leave their children with other people to rear and go off earning a career income sort of thing. And yeah, there's actually an untold story there, because one of the things when I was pregnant with my first child, the one they tried to steal, was I joined the Nursing Mothers Association. We actually took breastfeeding and mothering back off the medical system without them really realising what we did. So, and that's a very untold story. And it started in Australia too, that story. 6 women in a lounge room in Melbourne in 1966. You know, they turned the tide as to what happened during childbirth, husbands being there with them, and what happened with the baby, how it was fed and where it slept, and all of those decisions were made by the parents after we stole it all back. One of the most significant, I mean, I think, you know, part of what's wrong with our culture today is that when they medicalised the Western medical system, they separated all babies in the 60s and put them in central nurseries and encouraged mothers to bottle feed them with these new scientific fangled artificial formulas made by companies like Nestle and whatnot. And, you know, most parents, and circumcision, there's a whole discussion unto itself. You know, and all those things were routine, and babies in central nurseries left to cry until the magic 4 hours was up. And we women stole all that back, like women's business, and took it back without them sort of really realising what we were doing. But then I saw where it all changed, and women were just driven to go into the paid workforce and become consumers, and then all of that went out the window, really, sadly. Anyway.
Kristen, do you want to start with, you know, having a little bit of a, give Chantelle an idea, because Gabby heard some of your story the other day, but kind of to put it so we can get at a foundation so Chantelle can understand a little bit more about your adoption experience. Do you want to start out about, you know, why you were adopted out in the first place, how that came about? And
yeah, I think I usually I sort of often open conversations with this. Can you believe that I was sold for 50 quid in 1953 by one of those, you know, Masonic fellas to some old Masonic friends of his? And that's the truth. The doctor that delivered me had his own private hospital establishment in South Melbourne. These elite of the gold city of Melbourne, it's one of those miracle cities that went from, you know, nothing in 1836 to one of the most amazing cities on the planet 50 years later. Sort of, how does that happen?
Oh, the history.
Anyway, yeah, so I mean, why I was adopted was slightly different. My mother was, my parents were married. My father was an Irish Catholic. He'd come to Australia because he was stationed in Japan after they dropped the nuclear bombs. He was in the British Air Force. I think he met my grandfather, actually, who was under a coal mine because he was a merchant seaman and not a military man. And they were taken from Changi, which was a prison camp, Japanese prison camp. And he was actually working underground when they dropped the bomb in Nagasaki. And I from memory, that's when somehow my father, who was, said, was in the British Air Force. He was a radio technician on aircraft. Anyway, he came to Melbourne, met my mother when she was about 12, I reckon, and left it until she was 15 before he impregnated her first go. And looking back at my family history, that was his first act of paedophilia within our family. Anyway, he got a special dispensation to marry her. I've got an older sister who's just a couple of years older than me, and I had an older brother who passed away last year. He was 15 months older than me. And my father worked away in New Guinea. So somehow she went to the local doctor who was Australian at heart, who was a very wealthy man and very well connected. He was born in the US of A, actually. Not that that's sort of relevant, but anyway. He was actually named in the Victorian Parliament in the 50s there for this trade in children. But anything, I mean, Julian Assange, can attest to that, and Alicia and people, everyone, the secrets in Australia are tightly held. And, I mean, they did manage to put a very comprehensive mini series on television a few years ago and expose the underbelly of the criminal element in Melbourne. But they couldn't do an underbelly show and expose the criminal element of the elite of Melbourne yet, obviously. Anne Hamilton Burden is a perfect example of that. They just left her alone to die, comfortably at 100 years of age for all the crimes that that evil woman committed, and all the tie-ins that Alicia explored. So I was a part of all that, really. I mean, my mother went for an abortion, and Melbourne was soaked in eugenics too, from the 20s through to the 60s. It was like they closed the door on the theory and opened the door to the practice, in a way. That's when it was in the 60s when the federal Australian government swayed all the state governments to introduce standard adoption legislation throughout. Adoption's a state responsibility. They do that. They divvy up who gets to be responsible for what sort of thing. But anyway, so states are responsible for adoption, and the federal government sort of swayed them all and that's when they actually closed up the adoption records tight, so that, we're a part of an experiment where, you take a newborn infant, you tightly close up its identity. So, and then, I mean, a lot of countries never closed the identity aspect of adoption. I mean, really, one of our fellow adoptees who passed away a couple of years ago, William, but he argued for a case of stewardship, and why change the identity of the child? Like, why should we have to lose our identities and who we are to fulfil a colonistic legislation that should be relegated to the dustbin along with the White Australia policy and all of those evil laws that those men thought up? And Australia, well, people are just realising what Australia is, aren't they?
Yeah.
So
Actually,
your mum, I was going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to expand on what you were saying, Christine, it's it's very, very shocking to hear that it's these doctors, these hospitals that have actually been working in conjunction with the cult network to basically procure children from vulnerable mothers, from vulnerable communities, for their eugenics projects, for their trafficking rings.
That was a part of it. I think, because my mother went to the doctor for an abortion, but he talked her into, I'll find a good home for your child. And then, I mean, my father and mother and full siblings, I've got two older full siblings and a younger full sibling before our mother killed herself. And they were all born, in the western suburbs where they lived, but I was over the river in the eastern suburbs. And as I said, he was actually named in Parliament, and I, like they still say, too many important names, like shh, be quiet.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, and he was very blasé too. Like, I didn't even, by law, I was supposed to have a guardian ad litem. And they got my mother's signature, which they got, I think, when I was 7 days old, in the office. Like, she wasn't pressured like a 15-year-old. She made a decision. She wasn't looking for adoption. She never accepted the concept. She was looking for child protection for all her children, and it wasn't available. She married an evil man. She had been impregnated, and then married a very evil human being, Irish Catholic Jesuit, result of. His second name was Ignatius, for goodness sake.
You said
my mother said, one thing she said was, don't put her in a Catholic family. And that actually not only saved my butt, but it saved me losing my daughter, actually. I'll tell you that story. But so my mother never accepted the concept that I belonged to somebody else. And I was adopted by a couple in the Riverland, like on the far side of the state from where my family lived in Melbourne. And she used to come looking for me a number of times until she eventually found me just the year before I started school. I was 5. And she found me at the swimming pool, which was very logical in those days, prior to air conditioning. And sent my older brother and sister over. Actually, my adoptive mother had made me stay in the baby pool to mind my younger brother, and I was a bit annoyed. Anyway, these 2 kids joined me and started playing with me, and then they took me over to their mother, our mother. I don't recall any of the conversation that went on between myself and my mother. I'm not even sure how long we got together. I think maybe 5 minutes at the most. And when my adopter, who was a very, just a total narcissist, but my female adoptress was a very beautiful youngest daughter of a very elite family, so well-educated, well-spoken, looked beautiful. So she got away with the narcissism often. Anyway, mostly. So she immediately launched into, she dragged me away. I remember that. She hurt me to get me away from my mother and my siblings. And then it was all about her, she's screeching like, she's going to steal my daughter. And my adoptive father tried to talk her into just let it go. We can keep an eye on it, it's our community. She's just a woman there with 3 little kids, eh? And but no, she wanted to go, but he wouldn't be scared away in his own community. So we moved over to the other side of the pool, and there was like a building swimming club. And I remember just standing there looking at all these women hugging my adoptress, and she's still sobbing loudly, like, she's going to steal my daughter, she's going to steal my daughter. And I remember I'm 5 years of age. I hadn't started. Next week I went to school. The next week, and I looked at these women hugging this woman, and I thought, why isn't anybody hugging me? Because I knew my heart was broken, and my mother's heart was broken because she went home and didn't cope for about a year after that, and then one day she went into the bathroom and turned gas taps on. She didn't die straight away, actually. She died 5 days later when my siblings were 10, 9 and 3. Oh, yeah, so...
Chris, you were you mentioned once before, and I know you've told me, is that the doctor didn't agree to the abortion because you were a specific type of baby that could be laundered into adoption. That's what you were telling it. Like, that's.
I just learned about my blood group's Rh negative, A negative. And it's only in the last decade, really, that I stumbled onto the RH negative world online. And it's pretty mind-blowing, actually. People have some pretty amazing opinions on the matter. So I've sort of just sifted through it all. But I do see that perhaps there's a correlation between why he aborted. He was doing, he was making a fortune. He lived in a mansion, you know, and owned his own private hospital. And, you know, and it seemed like he was aborting some babies and I'll find a good home for your child, sort of. And as I said, I was traded up. People that he traded me to were old family friends, and they were like a very, you know, top echelons Victorian family. So, so I got like top shelf, really. Actually, the good thing I did get was it was on the Murray River, you know, and well, our doctoress was a narcissist, so she didn't give a rat's ass, basically, but she kept up appearances. So we were like a lot of kids in those days, so in the 50s and 60s, you know, as long as you came home and ate, you were fine. You know? So I just had a complete, looking back on it, you know, I had a complete freedom that just, and, you know, as a parent, I was able to make that call really well too. You know, and I was actually thanked by one of the lads that grew up and under my wing and said, thanks for the last free childhood. So, yeah.
Can I just here, Chris, that there was a psychiatrist that was treating a lot of the adoptive parents and particularly the adoptive mothers, and his Dr. Rickaby was his name, and he's
wonderful.
Yes,
Yeah.
he was documenting that majority of the adoptive mothers that came through his service were suffering from a mental health issue. So they all had all these adoptive parents had these mental health issues that he knew clearly about. And he clearly knew, because I actually met him at the federal apology. And I remember being introduced to him because he was quite old and retired. And I got introduced as an adoptee who lobbied, but also who had suffered abuse. And his immediate reaction was, oh, I thought they'd all died. So,
well, actually, he and I are on the
died.
same page. I actually joined the mental health system in South Australia in the 2000, the early 2000s, the first decade of this century. And I did it deliberately. I thought, where are all the adopted people? And then I was wise enough to know that most of us, well, we don't run lukewarm. We're all or nothing, really. So we're successful. A lot of us are successful. A lot of us are actors and comedians and whatnot. But a lot of us are in jail and in mental wards particularly, you know, and just living on the streets and down and out. So, yeah, no, I joined the mental health system, and I actually got really lucky, actually, and I got to twice in a row interview all the people that they kept long-term in the mental health wards in South Australia. And I threw in a couple of my own questions, and about 95% of them, I think, had abandonment issues, of one sort or another. You know, so the majority of mentally ill people are, you know, abandoned, abused along the way.
Some stage, yeah, it's such a deep wound, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sure some people are born, you know, with issues, but I think they're few and far between, really, and most of the people that get labelled. I mean, when they tried to label me with schizoid affective disorder, I think, rather than schizophrenia. And I asked this old psychiatrist, like, what's that? And he said, oh, well, you know, you can't determine the difference between reality and fantasy. And I'm like, oh, you mean like you're a brand new infant and they take you, bang, and give you to those two deserving adults, but then the government steps in and aids and abets them and, you know, manufactures a fake ID like birth certificate that says that this genetic stranger gave birth to you, and so that enables them to tell you porky pies And I said, I knew they were porcupines from when I was 22 months of age. And I mean, that's another story I can share with you. It's interesting, actually. I mean, 22 months of age, and I knew that, you know, I was one of those babies that popped up, but didn't come to tummy root. So I started watching you know, weighing up every word that was said to me. But 22 months of age, I had a photo of myself for a while, you know, up on the fridge. I was the cutest little cherub, questioning it all. Yeah, well, it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder from your first breath, basically. You're with strangers.
Yeah. Well, that separation from your mother, you know, we know that's such a traumatic way that they create this trauma, you know, in people to control them. And, you know, for adoptees, being separated from your mother at such an early stage under those circumstances, you know, it's just
funnily enough, without me sort of realising, it wasn't until I looked back. I mean, really, I've devoted my whole life to keeping mothers and their infants together one way or another. I mean, I was a nursing mums counsellor, a group leader, you know, I'm very involved in that world when my kids were little for, you know, more than a decade. And, you know, that's just, well, you can't breastfeed an infant really without it hanging off the breast. So, and yeah, so without, and I was a grief and loss counsellor too for the mothers that and fathers lost, you know, still, or even abortions, stillbirths, neonatal deaths. And mostly they were just swept under the carpet, like it's not important, you know, same as adoption, really. You know, you can have another one, you'll be right. Actually, it's not as bad as adoption, really, because you're better off knowing than not knowing who your child is, I think.
Yeah. And really, that's what systems should be about. Systems should be about keeping the family unit together. Like if we can have doctors and hospitals conspiring to separate these families and choose certain bloodlines because they're valued within these networks, you know, those systems should be actually set up to keep families together. You know, these vulnerable young mums should have support. That's all that's needed. But that's obviously not what the network is about. That doesn't make money and it doesn't feed what they need. So, you know, you don't have to look too deep into it to start realizing there's a really evil hand in all of this. And it's set up that way. It's a well-oiled machine.
Well, it's a control thing. And as soon as they interfere in your pregnancy, they're making money off you. I mean, back in those early days, you know, there was a huge industry around the abortions. You know, the police made huge amounts of money from the people that were carrying out the abortions, and it was a real tangled web. And yeah, I mean, as soon as they grab that baby, they need people to feed it, change it, look after it, like, you know, so people are employed. No, I've been on my own. I've brought up my children on my own since 1987. And one thing I've learned being a woman on my own is that they really don't like us. Men don't like us very much. That's, well, the world I inhabit anyway. They really don't like us. And they hate, most of all, they hate our ability to give birth. And they're working really hard. I went to a conference on surrogacy and we actually saw pictures of where they've got like a front pack, you know, and they can gestate their babies in their see-through so everyone can pat the baby. Anyway, it's a brave new world. I won't survive that long, I hope.
They actually saw the mother as neurotic. They any vulnerable mother that wanted to keep her baby, they immediately branded her as neurotic if she wanted to keep her baby. And it was like she had to somehow prove she wasn't neurotic by being all together, by handing over her baby. It was just the weirdest thing. So I've got a book here that is it's called Baby Stolen, Released in the Past. So it's just a wealth of information. But it says here, the more an unwed mother insisted she wanted to keep her child, the harsher she was judged. This placed her in a no-win situation. For instance, if she specifically expressed a desire to keep a child, she was most often labelled immature, sometimes psychopathic, even occasionally schizophrenic. Once she was so labelled, the ratcheting up of pressure, coercion and threats was justified, as the woman who insisted on keeping her child was now considered by adoption workers as the least fit to do so. Like, that just blows your mind. So a mother fighting
for your child.
Oh, my story illustrates what you reading there, Kerri. Like, after an eventful growing up years, I went back to Melbourne at 19 and jumped into a relationship with a bad boy, and I became pregnant through a contraception failure. This was in 1974, and I'm 20 years of age. 1972 was their peak year in Australia. They stole 10,000 infants in 1972 in Australia, which is a lot of infants for our population. Anyway, 1974, I'm pregnant and I'm happy. Like, I was actually offered an abortion, which I thought it was a bit presumptuous, really. And when I went through my pregnancy, I realised I was hooked up with a womanizer. And when I was 9 months pregnant, I left him and a female friend of ours to go to an antenatal visit at the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne, which is just a tram ride. And when I got to the hospital, there was some emergency and they turned me away. So I hopped straight back on a tram and I'm back home in 20 minutes instead of hours and hours. And I caught them having sex, so I'm out of there. And I went back to the Royal Women's Hospital and asked them for a safe place to stay. I was a week before I was due, my first baby, and I was very prepared. I'd read every book, and even when I realised I wasn't going to be doing it with him, it didn't really faze me. I mean, not all babies were taken from the single moms, so you know. Anyway, and I mean, I didn't know the threat that was out there, actually, to be quite honest. I had no idea. I just was pregnant and I was going to have the first person related to me, you know, as far as I was concerned. Anyway, yeah, she directed me across the road to St Joseph's. Now, my mother said, don't put her in a Catholic family. So I was directed across the road to St Joseph's receiving home in Grat Street. When I pulled up the next day in my Toyota Crown, I thought it was my lucky day getting it parked straight out the front. And in I go, and the little nun takes me into her office. And we chat away for quite a while. And then she, when I mentioned I had a car, she startled. And because I'm an adopted person, I've got hypervigilance. I love my hypervigilance. And I saw her startle. And then she got very bossy and told me to wait here and she'd go and get help. Despite my assurances I didn't need help, just tell me where to park my car. But anyway, she told me to wait. Off she goes and comes back. And while she was gone, I looked around. My mother said, don't put her in a Catholic family. So I hadn't been in a Catholic environment. And I looked around me and then I'm a bit blind in my left eye from an accident as a child. And I knew somebody was standing beside me and I flung around and there was a statue of Mary holding her infant son, Jesus. And she was about my height in white marble. Anyway, my instinct just went whoomp. And luckily I moved quickly and I ran to the door and luckily she hadn't locked me in. She thought about it. Anyway, I out the door and there were stairs going up and a long passage underneath the stairs and coming around the corner is the little nun in her habit and two big burly blokes in white. By the time I got into my car, they were trying to prevent me from leaving. One of them actually was so determined, he was on the bonnet of my car. Anyway, I still didn't get it though. I still didn't understand. And a week later when I went into labour and I arrived at the Royal Women's Hospital to give birth, I had no idea what these people that I thought were going to help me were going to do. Yeah, so just to cut a long story short, really, I experienced most of what the mothers experienced. I was tied down. I was abused emotionally and verbally and physically, being tied up and trying to give birth. They drugged me heavily, actually, as soon as my child was born, and they disappeared with her. I mean, I'd seen her. I screamed at them, "You bring my baby here." They were too scared not to, eh? But anyway, next morning, I don't think they intended to bring my baby to me, but karma kicked in, actually, and one of the nurses on duty had grown up in the same small community as me, like 500 kilometres away, and yeah, she tolerated me. She was quite a bit older than I was, but she used to tolerate me when I was little. And anyway, she made sure they brought my baby to me, but they still filled my head for 5 days that, you know, poisoned me, that I couldn't, I was everything that KERRI said. But I just stayed quiet, actually. I suppose I was replaying what I thought they'd done to my mother, you know, to get me. You know, so anyway.
Did they bring you some
on the 5th day, this is important, on the 5th day, Margaret had gone off duty and they offered me a private room. And when I asked why, they said, "Oh, well, you're going home tomorrow with your baby and you'll get more sleep." I thought, oh, they really do care. No. Anyway, so they put me and my baby in a steel cot, supermarket trolley cot type thing, and they came in mass, like about 6 of them, with their stethoscopes and white coats and whatever, and triangular hats, triangular hat. And the doctor spent 10 minutes messing with my head that my daughter had brain damage, and I needed to sign for a blood test, sign twice. And I was handed the pen, and the woman with the white triangular hat held the clipboard, and they wouldn't let me out of the bed, so I'm in the bed and they're all surrounding me, you know. And anyway, she's holding the clipboard, I've got the pen, to sign twice for the blood test. And so again, my hypervigilance kicked in, and I saw the white knuckles and realised how tightly she was holding that clipboard. So I managed to snatch it out of her hands before she realised. And then I can't believe how brave I was, really. And I covered myself by saying, "Oh, my dad taught me," and he did, my adopted dad, "my dad taught me that I should always sign things. I should always read things before I sign them. And I suppose being a new mum, I better get used to it, eh?" Anyway, the first signature on the piece of paper was for a blood test, but the bottom of that piece of paper was folded under, and so I had to lift up that sheet of paper, and the second sheet of paper was a consent to relinquish, and the second signature was a consent to relinquish. And if they'd managed to trick me into getting that signature, they would have, and this happened to a lot of mothers, they would have wheeled my baby out of that room because they had my signature, and I would have died in one of their institutions quite quickly because I would have fought them with every breath I took. And that's how a lot of mothers died in the first 12 months of losing their babies for those sorts of behaviours. And they still haven't properly apologised. That Royal Women's Hospital's calling us liars. Liars.
I was saying to
they're still being protected. You know, even this reparations they've announced in Victoria is just a con job, really. And most of us are dead anyway. They've waited long enough. One, you know, KERRI will tell you about Vicky, but another one of us, woman I've known for probably 20 years, really, online, who was a mother and an adoptee. She died. She was 12 years younger than me. Most of us are dead. I've been close a few times, but I'm just. I've got unfinished business,
haven't you? You've all waited a lifetime. And you've waited another generation for an apology and to be heard, and still waiting.
It's been 12 years since the Senate inquiry and state and federal apologies. And we've had numerous recommendations. New South Wales actually had an inquiry 9 years prior to the federal inquiry, and 400 mothers gave evidence in that, and they squashed everything. This is the only thing that survived out of that, right? So all the recommendations they buried. Mothers have now been buried that were promised compensation and redress and help and support. And, you know, many of our recommendations have never been fulfilled. And now Victoria has just had its own inquiry, and they've brought forth that they want to pay compensation to the mothers, but not the adoptees. They keep separating us. And so what they've said is they would give compensation to mothers who were in dire circumstances of $10,000. Now, I don't know about anybody else out there in the world that might be listening. How much money would you like to be compensated for having your child taken? How much money would you like to be compensated to have your life taken and given a whole new identity, and then to end up in a home where you were abused mentally, physically, or sexually? To me, there's no amount of money that could suffice for what happened to us. Correct. And so many of the mothers are now like in their 80s and 90s, and Dan Andrews, who's from, and I think it's just a political stunt, has come out with this, you know, we want to pay some mothers compensation. I keep playing this argument. I do not understand how anybody could possibly separate the trauma from the baby and the mother. They seem to separate us and make us a separate entity. And they say to us, well, you were adopted, it all turned out for you. Like, you're fine, you're not traumatized, right? Because the mothers were adults and they can clearly remember their trauma. Adoptees have what's called pre-verbal trauma. We're born into trauma. So we often find it very hard to speak about what we've experienced because it's pre-verbal. It's all cellular. So when we try and deal with things of today, whether it's grief or some sort of trauma, we find it very hard to articulate. We find it very hard to even find the words and the feelings associated with it. Now, I don't know if you guys know this. I lost my son 4 years ago. He was only 17 and a half. And I coped as a typical adoptee would normally cope, is that I was going on the remembrance of being torn from my mother at birth and having to cope with all the abuse. So when my son passed away, I automatically went into that same grounded sort of, you know, like, get on with it. You're in survival mode. There was no stop and absorb the grief. And in actual fact, it was very hard for me to connect with the grief because of being torn at birth and then being told my mother died giving birth to me. Pass the peas, please. There was never a time that grief was allowable for me. And for every adoptee, it's never allowable. You're not allowed to talk about what happened to you. You're never allowed to talk about how you feel about being adopted. You're not allowed to talk about whether you dislike being adopted for fear of the adoptive mother. Like in Chris's case, her biological mother appears at a pool, probably just to connect with her, make sure she's okay, reconcile herself to that loss. And the adoptive mother just tears her away and says, she's my child, she's my child. And Chris is caught in the middle watching this. So you imagine the effect for the rest of her life, that nothing matters but the adoptive mother, because everybody swam around the adoptive mother to nurture her and her pain and everything. Chris's mother went off and committed suicide, and Chris is left with this.
Actually, it was the same when she died. Like, I mean, that's a typical Australian community that I'm talking about, you know, country community that was fairly big, but everyone sort of thought they knew everyone's business sort of thing. When she died, and she lived there for 40 or 50 years, and she had a lot of friends, and I was the one that insisted on her, because she died of a terrible battle with cancer for a couple of years. That was in the late 80s, in the middle 80s. Anyway, I insisted on an open funeral, so hundreds of people came to the church in the local town. Oh, and so many of them. And these are the people that, you know, I'd grown up around. And so many of them were just telling me how lucky I was that she was my mother. And luckily, one of those people that was actually her closest friend said something slightly different. She said, weren't we lucky to know her? And she was the only one that didn't put it on me that my mother had just died, and wasn't I lucky? And I mean, I'm just so over being lucky, and she's not my mother. She actually destroyed my mother. And after our mother died, I said, I've got an evil father that my mother had worked very hard to try and protect children from. And anyway, so they're in his care now. So he put them all into Catholic hell. And when I reconnected, I was a trained counsellor. So I've heard all my full siblings, same mother, same father, and their stories and their evil Jesuit stories. And my brother was in St. Augustine's in Geelong. He was 15 months older than me. He died last year. I miss him every day, actually. We met when we were 5 and he was 6, actually, because it was actually knowing my brother 30 years later, because that memory of the swimming pool, I probably when I saw that vision that I told you about everyone hugging Olive, actually after that, it was really interesting, actually, like on a spiritual level. When we were leaving the pool, it was dark, about 9 o'clock, I guess. They'd gone. But I remember I disobeyed my adopters and dropped my towel and what I was carrying. And I went over and I dived in the pool where I'd met Anne and Kieran, my brother and sister, and it was the Bubs pool, and it had animals, fish painted on the bottom, and where I'd met them there was an octopus. So I held my breath and I went all around the octopus, holding my breath, and in my head I'm saying Coral, and Coral's my mother's name, hence my surname Coralive, which is my legal surname, by the way. I was nameless because of adoption, so I made up my own name. Coral lives, and she lives through us and my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
That's so
She's so proud, eh?
So beautiful.
Anyway, I outlined the octopus. I'm 5, right? A week before I started school. And the whole time in my head I'm saying Coral lives under the water, Coral lives under the water. And I never met Coral again. She was long gone when I turned up when I was 37, and they opened the legislation in Victoria and allowed us to find out who we are and who our family is. And I'm a bit incensed, really, because you hear about, and I've got a lot of friends that are original Australians, but, you know, and they talk about their lost culture and their lost languages and what colonisation has cost them. But my family are Gaelic-speaking Irish. They speak Gaelic. And I've lost all that culture and that language and, you know, that concept of being Irish. And we go right back to pagan times, you know, in Ireland. And we can trace that back, actually. I've just been doing it recently. And all that was stolen away from me under the guise of adoption. So I don't really see the difference. I mean, yes and no. I understand the concept of a group loss, you know, anyway. Yeah, adoption, I just think it should be banned, it should be abolished. And we did, apparently ARA, which is Adoptee Rights Australia, which is getting very active in the political world of adoptees. They argued in their submission to the Victorian government that adoption should be seen as, you know, an aberration of the past. Stop trading in babies. In Australia, we have 25 million people here in Australia, and we've got nearly 50,000 children in out-of-home care. And I think if we started tallying that up, it's like, say, South Africa or whatever, we would find, I think we would be the world leaders in still removing children from their families.
Yeah.
So much talk of corruption in our bureaucracies. It's just every day and
And
every way and every state, I think.
and it's so
it's
hidden
just
from the general
us
public too. These things are still happening because it's still hidden from the general public. Like, whereas we can look at places like Canada, and at least, they're starting to talk about their residential schools and all of the forced adoption and all of that. Hello, Australia. Like, we're still like living in the dark ages, like trying to shut all of this stuff down. And I wanted to chat as well of Christian. I remember from the last time we spoke about the drugs that were being used in when children were about to be taken away as another way of, disrupting that mother-child bond. And actually, it was drugs that are given to young vulnerable mothers to dry up the breast milk, I believe.
There were three lots, Gabby. There was the barbiturates. There was a drug called Bomidorm. It was a drug used to ensure that the mother stayed compliant. And it was often given to her weeks before she gave birth. And then before she gave birth, they wanted to make sure that the milk dried up. So they were giving him a drug called stilbestrol. And a lot of the mothers had no idea. And I know Chris shared when we spoke privately that she was offered this drug and she had full intentions of keeping her baby, so she never took it. Now, stilbestrol is I'll just read it. It's a synthetic non-steroidal estrogen, and it was first synthesized in 1938, and it's classified as an endocrine disruptor. Now, the problem is that it's a drug that passes the placenta. So whilst they were giving it to the mothers while they were pregnant, the child is being affected. So it causes cancer, it causes breast cancer, vaginal cancer, cervical cancer, testicle cancer in males. And it also causes, the research is that it's not just cancers, it's things like schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, mood disorders. And it's also they've researched it, some doctors have pulled out that it can even affect, and mostly the girls, on whether their sexuality. So they become homosexual. So it was a banned drug. It can stay dormant in the system for up to 50 years. And the problem is that many of the adopted children cannot get their mother's records. So we don't even know if we've been affected.
I don't. Wow.
So it causes autoimmune diseases. So I've been lobbying since 1983. I've got an autoimmune disease. I reckon nearly every adoptee I've run into has had some form of autoimmune disease or some form of cancer or back issues. I've got both, but so very few doctors know this. It's actually in the Cancer Council. So if you go on their website, you'll actually find more about the drug and the tests that you're supposed to have. But it's not just an adoptee, it's my children as well that are affected. And in America, what they say here was something like millions of women in America were given it, and it was basically, they kind of brought it out to stop women from having early pregnancies and problems in carrying their baby.
Well, that's what they said, isn't it?
Yeah, it was used to drive their milk, and then on top of it, they were given fentobarb, which is a drug to. They just would wipe the mothers out. So a lot of mothers actually left the hospital. We've got records of mothers not even remembering they gave birth. A person will show up 40 years later and say, your mother, and they go, what are you talking about? So this is how, how drugged out they were.
Barbiturates, the barbiturate family was experimented with, like the CIA were using that as one of the first drugs with MK Ultra. So to hear that they're doing that on pregnant mums and their unborn babies, this is like wartime technology that they're unleashing on people in the population.
So we get on to compensation. If you talk about compensation, it's not just mental, this is physical. This is affecting us every day of our life and affecting our children. And yet the general public and even our GPs, I remember the first GP I went to and shared it with her, she had no idea. So I went to another one, and he at least was aware, and he was saying it had to be tested, you know, time and time again. There was a great deal of concern, but the only reason I know about it is because I got involved in the inquiry, but many adoptees didn't, and many have no idea that this is how they're affected by what they did, you know. So it's pretty horrific stuff.
This is insane.
Just makes you wonder how many women were subject to this as well, you know, like obviously they've used it with adoptees and young mums, but who's to say, knowing what these guys are like, what other young mums.
So it was that injection that a couple of days after I'd given birth, and I did have access to my baby, but they were pressuring me. But when they came in and they were about to jab me with this, and I said, "What's that?" And she said to dry up your milk.
Oh, not even
realise really what their intention was. I mean, up until that point, I mean, I'd never given birth before, and I didn't really realise what they were up to. And luckily, I refused it. As I said when we spoke earlier, I did have an injection which they call Rogan, which was a fairly new drug back there in the early 70s, and that's because I'm an Rh negative mother, and I gave birth to Rh positive children. I need to have this injection. I mean, that's a long, thousands of years history thing, and I don't know whether that's a part of bloodline they're talking about in relation to Masons and whatnot. I've got a feeling there's a connection there. But
can I read, Chris? Can I read out this little bit?
Stop me from creating antibodies that will destroy my positive babies. And the interesting thing about that, I joined a website, Rh Negative Warriors of Light, which is a worldwide group of Rh negative women, and that is kept secret from we negative women, that we really need to be having babies with negative males so we don't have issues in relation to creating antibodies that are going to be dangerous for the first one you get away with because you haven't created antibodies yet. In the past, you know, often women would have one live baby and then lots of stillbirths. To me, the curious thing about that is that because they've known about that for eons. I'm sure it's in the Bible, it is, you know, but that information went underground really. I mean, I wonder why they used to do blood tests in America and Australia before you got married, sort of thing. I don't know. But anyway, when talking to these women, there's thousands of women on that group from all around the world that are Rh negative, and we're not told. And they actually worked out the Rh negative thing in today's scientific world. Well, the Nazis isolated it and created this Rogan injection that prevents us from creating the antibodies. So, I mean, I've had 4 live babies and a stillbirth. But in the past, I wouldn't have had that one live baby. Yeah, so that's interesting, that Rh factor.
I was going to read out, because I thought you might find this interesting, the attitude of the paediatricians of the day. It said in the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne, it's quoted in the Medical Journal of Australia dated 30th July 1960 as saying the last thing that an obstetrician might concern himself with is the law in regard to adoption. Dr. Lawson also went on to give class distinction examples of how low on the ladder of life single mothers were. He arrogantly assumed himself to be the pinnacle of creation. He quoted another obstetrician, a Dr. R.L. Stevenson. There are men and classes of men who stand above the common herd, the soldier, the sailor, the shepherd, not infrequently, the artist, rarely. Rarely still the clergyman, the physician almost as a rule. He is the flower of our civilization. That's how the physicians saw themselves. That single mothers were the lowest of class, and it was all this class distinction, lowest of low. The doctors were God, basically.
Really, hey.
And that's in the medical journal, 1960.
Yeah,
Like,
not even trying to hide that whatsoever.
no,
Yeah.
no. So they said, when it comes to single mothers, ignore the law.
Actually,
So
but
this is
having been a single mother since my children were quite young, and I've got 2 sons and 2 daughters, and I reared a whole number of young men, and I understand why they're so determined now, because if the women bring up the boys think differently, and that's what the men don't want. They don't want, well, the girls too, but the children think differently. If the main voice that they're getting is a strong female voice, then those children are brought up differently. And I guess one of the things that taught me that was, my sons are in their 40s, but over the years, any women girlfriends that they've had have always said, like, your sons are such gentlemen. Yeah, and they're not, like, they've often commented, like, they're not waiting for somebody to come and do the dishes, make order of their lives. And yeah, so but that's my opinion from looking back, especially being adopted. My kids didn't have any uncles or grandparents, or that was just me and the kids, basically. And bringing up girls I had a daughter and then 2 sons and a daughter. But bringing up the sons, it was in a vacuum, really. So, yeah, but I realised in hindsight that that's what they're so terrified of, that, these children will grow up with the strong female voice. Oh, that's scary. No more wars.
It's what connection does, doesn't it? Strong families create strong children, and that's strong adults.
Yeah, even if you have a strong family, with paedophilia and those sorts of dangers, when the men aren't around, the children are more targeted. But, yeah.
I thought one thing that was really interesting that you told me, Kristin, that I just wanted to make sure we touch on was how, obviously these networks are targeting and creating intergenerational abuse, and that's done through these intergenerational adoption, intergenerational sexual traumas within the networks, etc. And you actually knew about like a cult which is operating within Victoria and South Australia. So with Anne Hamilton Burns actually having psychologists and mental health teams in these medical facilities where vulnerable young women are going to either get counselled about, not being able to actually have this child, or, maybe feeling it was an unplanned pregnancy or whatever. So it's not just that they were testing for, this particular bloodline, which they like to manipulate, but they actually had people on the grounds enticing people, basically.
They were actually one of the things I wondered, because in 1974, when they were so desperate to get hold of my eldest daughter, I saw other more vulnerable mothers come through, and they sort of left them alone. It was sort of starting to slide down in 1974. Probably it was about 50, 60, maybe got to keep the 60%, got to keep their babies by then, because Whitman had introduced money for single mothers. But I've lost track now.
Got the question, Chris. It was about Anne Hamilton Burns.
Anne Hamilton Burns. I know for a fact. It's really a very interesting thing about the family. And before they were known as the family, they go to the eugenics I was talking about. Victoria was just eugenics place. We were taught eugenics at school, and we were divided through primary school. They tested us, and we were put into 1A, B, C, D. We were all. I think Victoria was probably worse than the other states in Australia for that sort of thing. But Anne Hamilton, and before they were known as the family, sounds a bit more innocuous, they were the White Brotherhood.
Mm.
And they were specifically, I mean, we were like the same as America, Operation Paperclip. We got a whole contingency of Nazi scientists sent our way after the Second World War. They especially blended into places like South Australia, where there was already a large population of German people that were good people, good German people that had been in Australia for 100 years, running away from religious oppression. But the other newer Germans could blend in, you know what I mean? So, you know, and they went into, I think they went into full-on mode, and the family, I guess, you know, they were breeding a family of children. And Sarah Byrne, who's dead now, she became a GP. She was the one that helped blow it open when they were kids. And she went on to become a GP, and then she wrote a book called Unseen, Unheard, Unknown, about in the 90s, I think she published it. And it was an expose on growing up in the family. Her life just went downhill from the moment that book was published, and she died quite young. As you do when you're a whistleblower. But that family is a bit interesting for me because, well, Julian Assange touched in on the family when he was a teenager, so he knows about the secrets that were all around him that needed to be exposed. So I think that was his formation, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And then I had a touch-in with them when I was a teenager through my very favourite uncle. And I think he was just sort of giving me a warning shot over my bow, which I sort of needed. But he used the family to do it. I don't believe he would have left me with them like he was threatening to.
Right, right.
And another friend of mine who's also an adoptee who was experimented on by the Catholics, like, you know, fire boy. Oh, man. His mother introduced him to the family when he was young. And all three of us, like that I know of, Julian and my friend Michael and myself, are all just absolute warriors for the truth. Mm. So we came across when we were in our formative years this great big secret in the form of this cult. And as you say, it was full of, they actually had a mental health hospital, like a private. Actually, when I managed to con my adopters when I was 15, instead of running away from home, my two best friends were going to Methodist Ladies College. You can't get much more Freemason demolay than that. So I managed to con my adopters into sending me off to Methodist Ladies College when I was 15. So I was in Melbourne, like in the 60s. And I probably got to be my first anarchy. My first anarchy was when I was 8. But we had the moratorium marches where we changed our government's mind about sending out young boys off to fight an imperialistic war that had nothing to do with us before they were even entitled to vote. Excuse me. And we got out there in force, and we haven't seen that again until last year. And on the morning of the moratorium marches, our headmistress at Methodist Ladies College said, "If you young ladies think you're going to go join the riffraff," well, that was enough for me. I decided I'm not going to wear my hippie gear that a handful of us were sneaking out to go and march with the riffraff. So I wore my full Methodist Ladies College. And I'm proud to say I got on the news and I got my first punch from a copper, in the face. And I probably got on the ASIO list, I'm pretty sure.
Well done. That was your beginning.
I tell them the politicians are scared of me in Australia, the ones I come across. Like I just tell them to their faces. And actually, the truth is, and adoptees are just starting to work this out finally, they're terrified of us. We're like the cuckoo in the nest. A lot of us got privilege and good education, not all of us, but a lot of us did. But, you know, we've got an insight anyway, no matter what, into, you know, the world of control and power, really. Yeah, and so we're like cuckoos in the nest. So when you scratch their surface, like if you confront, you know, people right to their face and not be polite about it, they're scared of us actually, because, you know, well, we're the cuckoo in the nest. We know because we grew up, you know, with them, listen to what they had to say, and yeah, so.
But that street smart life experience that carries you through as well. And that's it's emotional intelligence, social intelligence is so much more often.
I didn't get to be street smart until I learned when I met my family of origin midlife. Certainly that was a big quantum leap. They were all much more street smart than me. And they grew up in northwest Western Australia, like into Kimberley, and, you know, out in the whoop. My father installed long distance telecommunication equipment. Yeah,
hey, go
but
there,
I didn't get street smart until I became a whistleblower in South Australia and put my life at risk and my children's life at risk. And actually, I remember saying to a corrupt copper one day when we were having an interlude, I said, and I'm like 40, and I said to him, "And you corrupt so-and-sos have stolen my innocence." And I remember he just looked down at me, and he had a very Germanic name, and he looked down at me with his pale blue eyes and just like snorted with laughter and said, "Oh, isn't it about time?" You know, and I could concede his point really, but yeah. So become a whistleblower, then you really find out what our dominant culture's about. Yes.
Yeah, wow.
Not recommended for your health though.
Yeah.
And I blame adoption for that. I think I was actually suicidal, and being a Leo snake born when the Mars, Mercury and the Sun were all conjunct in the sky, I just thought, you know, I'll take out all the paedophiles, especially the well-connected ones with me, you know. So I was a bit remorseless there for about 20 years. Yeah.
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 Wow. Amazing. Just amazing. And again, you know,
thank you, Chantelle. It's yeah, I don't really, I've got to put them all down in a book, but yeah, I've been interviewed and they've never
I was
been
gonna say, I think, you know, I mean, so many of these amazing stories, you should be writing books, or at least articles, you know, blogs or something where people.
I said I was a whistleblower in South Australia for the last 25 years, and single mum, and they just were so close to destroying me. And I live up in central Queensland now, and I've got a food forest, and I'm in a little valley, and I'm a hermit, and I'm just sort of thinking I might survive long enough to do a bit more damage before I go.
You're right. You're around and alive for a reason, honestly, and especially at these times, you know. When
looking back on my life, I'm in awe of the child I was. I mean, I said, I knew at 22 months of age, and I can't believe. Like, I'll give you an example. I mean, you know, that terrible experience just the week before I started school. And a year later, I skipped a grade, actually. I was as bright as a button. And so I'm in grade 2, and my teacher, who adored me and I loved her, she's teaching us about the kings and queens of England. So I piped up and said to her that I didn't want to learn about the kings and queens of England. And she asked me why. And I said, well, it's just a little island over the other side of the world, and I can't see why it's relevant to us Australians. And I didn't know I was Irish. I mean, maybe my mum must have told me, you know, that I was Irish, I guess, but I don't have any memory of what we talked about. But yeah, there I am, you know, and I was bright as a button and was happy to learn anything else. But yeah, and how Irish is that? And then when I met my family of origin,
must be genetic.
one of my Irish relatives is Owen Barry, and Leonard Cohen sang a song about Owen Barry, who was 18 and a medical student in 1916 uprising, and the British captured him and tortured him for a week. And he said, "Shoot me like a soldier, don't hang me like a dog." well, they hung him like a dog, and the whole of Tipperary had their hats off to my relative Owen Barry. So, you know, looking back, even though I didn't know, I've got those genes in me, and I've been fighting them in my own way from when I was that, you know. So I'm really proud of that little girl that I was. And I say to adoptees, you know, like they can take you away, but they can't take it away from you unless you give it to them. It's like a bit of a distinction. And sadly, you know, most of us do compromise. I mean, you know, it's a terrible, I don't know, even with really good, wonderful, committed, you know, adoptive parents, there's still a great big aching void in the middle.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I so appreciate you telling your story. And again, KERRI, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Kristen. And of course, thank you, lovely Gabby. I think every story that gets out there is just more empowering. I look forward to hearing many more stories, actually, because I think people are definitely stepping up and stepping out now. So I want to say thank you so much for your bravery. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for sharing, you know, and just thereby giving others permission to actually do the same as well. So thank you, ladies, very, very much. Our time is sadly over, but I would love to have you ladies back again at some point in the future. I think there's never too much to share on these topics. I was just saying beforehand, you know, as well, my niece, who lives in Australia, also had a teenage pregnancy, and this was a decade ago. And what she was saying to me as well is that these girls are pretty much locked into their wards.
Yeah.
And 1 out of 20 girls leave with their baby. So this is not something which, and she was, because she was 16, she was a senior. But there's 13, 14, 15-year-olds that don't get treated very well by all accounts in these places. So it's still happening, it's still occurring, it's still something that we really should be taking notice of, and we should be literally spreading the word. This is unacceptable. You know, the way women and babies have been treated by these freaks is absolutely unacceptable. It really, really is.
Motherhood is extremely sacred, and it's sacred to the
Totally
child.
is.
Yes.
Any woman who's had a child will know that. Any woman who's even come close, any woman who's had a miscarriage, any woman who's given birth to a stillborn will know the trauma that goes along with that. And to have your child forcibly removed from you in these deceptive circumstances, no, this is unacceptable. I can never accept that. Never will I even come close to accepting that that's okay. So the more of us who are aware of these stories, we've got to stand up and we've got to make our voices heard. So I say thank you again for making your voices heard for so many out there at the moment who don't have a voice and who feel powerless and who don't have the tools at this point to step up. But I look forward to more and more, definitely, of these stories coming to the fore.
Thank you,
So thank you
Chantelle.
so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Kristen. That was great sharing.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. It really was. Thank you. And to our subscribers, as you know, our channel was taken down a week ago, so please give us a like, a share, and a subscribe on our new channel, yeah? Find us on Solutions with Aquarius Rising Africa, which I will be there in a few minutes with Catherine Edwards. We doing a whole thing on animals, so those of you who love animals, it's really part of our solutions for the 5D consciousness is not just how we treat our children and each other, but most definitely our animals as well. So thank you so much, guys. God bless you all. Take good care of yourselves, and see you very, very, very soon.